Evening. I know. I always feel like I'm standing over here asking them to be quiet. Well, I'm thrilled that you have had such a dynamic discussion with each other. Thank you very much. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Justin. Justin's a very well-renowned BBC journalist, formerly world correspondent in Washington for BBC Radio, and now co-host of the Today programme. So thank you very much, Justin.
Thank you very much. You said Today programme as if people here would not have heard of it, but everyone here has been on it, judging by certainly the people right in front of us here. So it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a huge pleasure to be here with Brian. And I want to share with you first something that I hadn't shared with him, but which I think really brings home the relevance of his book. This afternoon, halfway through the afternoon, I get a call from the PM programme on Radio 4, which you've probably all been on as well. And they say to me, could you come on really urgently and do something for us this evening about Tucker Carlson going to Russia to interview Putin? We've tried Brian Klaas, but he says it's at an event. I'm thinking, it's a fluke. Oh, wait. We're all of us. Talk about solipsism. We're actually living in Brian's mind. So it's a particular pleasure, with that having happened, to introduce him. I've read all his books, and I'm sure everyone has here, and I just think they get better and better and more interesting. He was discovered by the BBC because I met him somewhere, I think one at your book events, and I thought, God, he's really good. He's really good at explaining stuff and talking about American politics and all the rest of it. And I said to him, where do you live? And at that time, he was living right next to Broadcasting House. And I'm not saying that that's how we choose people at the Today programme, but he then became a firm favourite because he was not only loquacious and able to explain things, but also he lived very close. So possibly as a result of being on so often, he's now moved away. So Brian, thank you very much for doing this and inviting me to talk to you. The rest of the evening will be all about you and about this fascinating book. Let us start with a story you tell right at the beginning that kind of sets the scene for it all. And it's about Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and also about Kyoto.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for coming tonight. The story that opens the book is a story of a tourist couple. And they go to Kyoto, Japan in 1926, to Kyoto, and they fall in love with the city. And normally when we think about vacations, they don't change the world. But this one changed the world because 19 years later, in 1945, the husband of the couple was America's Secretary of War. His name is Henry Stimson. And the generals were deciding where to drop the first atomic bomb. The Target Committee, which was tasked with this, agreed Kyoto is the number one pick. And they disparagingly referred to this as Stimson's pet city. Right? He got this soft spot for it. And by chance, they were planning to drop the bomb right on the rail yards in the middle of the city, which was next to the hotel he stayed at. So he was not pleased about this, and he twice went to meet with President Truman and convinced him to take Kyoto off the list. So on August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima instead. And the second atomic bomb was supposed to go to a place called Kokura. But when the bomber arrived at the drop site, there was this brief, unpredicted cloud cover. And the bomber circled and eventually realized it was going to run out of fuel, so it went to the secondary target of Nagasaki. Now, the reason I start the book with this is because chaos theory is a key theme of this. And one of the things that we do is we tend to ascribe big, obvious reasons for why things happen. That's the way our brains work. It's the way social science, my own discipline, works. And in this instance, the proximate cause of why hundreds of thousands of people died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki rather than in Kyoto and Kokura was a 19-year-old vacation and a cloud. And so the idea that small changes have ripple effects that produce profound consequences is it's the opening story of the book because it's a theme throughout where it's at odds with the way that we tell ourselves the way the world works.
The other story that's right at the beginning of the book is a more personal one about the randomness of your own life.
Yeah, so this is a story from 1905 in a place called Keeler, Wisconsin, a little farmhouse in Keeler, Wisconsin. And there's a woman in the story named Clara Jansen who has 4 young children. The oldest, I believe, is 5 years old at the time in 1905. And she has a mental breakdown, and it's a tragedy. She decides to take the lives of her own kids. So she kills all 4 of her kids, and then she takes her own life, and her husband comes home, and you can only imagine what it would be like to come home and your whole family is dead. And the reason it's in the opening chapter of Fluke is because this is my great-grandfather's first wife, Clara. And I'm not related to her because that branch of the family tree ended with her. And so he remarried a few years later to my great-grandmother. And sort of like with the kokura thing, there's a phrase in Japanese parlance to this day called kokura's luck, where you unknowingly escape disaster, right? And this is the people of Kokura for decades didn't know they were the target for the second atomic bomb. It was a top secret thing that was later declassified. Similarly, I didn't know about this mass murder in my family's history until I was in my mid-20s. And the first thing you think is, well, this is a dark chapter in the family history. The second thing you think is, if those kids didn't die, I wouldn't exist. And the bewildering part, and this is the chaos theory, is if those kids didn't die, you wouldn't be here, because you wouldn't be listening to my voice, because I wouldn't be here. So that's the strange thing about how all this fits together, and I think there's a part of Fluke that originated when I heard that story in my mid-20s, trying to think about how you make sense of feeling like a cosmic accident, which I very much do.
I want to get to the making sense of it in a second, but there is a third story, which actually is later on in the book, and is a shorter thing, but it involves a football in the sea, which I found actually quite affecting. I'm not quite sure why, because none of this is a surprise to us, is it? We know about randomness intellectually. Tell us about the football.
Yeah, I love what you, before I get to the story, I love what you just said, because one of the things that's been remarkable in talking about the book is people don't tend to push back on the underlying argument. I think it's intuitive to us that these small things make a difference, but so much of the world runs on the myth that they don't, right? That you ignore the noise and focus on the signal. But the story is about a man named Ivan who went swimming off the coast of Greece. And there was a really strong riptide, and he wasn't a very strong swimmer. So he got ripped out to sea. And he was missing for 24 hours, and we know how stories end when someone's at sea for 24 hours. But this story had a different ending because as he was about to drown, he spotted a soccer ball on the surface of the ocean and swam towards it and was able to survive as a result of this. Now already this is sort of an interesting story, but what makes it particularly interesting, and it gets some of the core ideas I talk about in the book, is that when they showed this story on the Greek news, there was this woman who was watching it, and I like to imagine in my head she's sipping her coffee and drops her mug on the floor and is astonished by what she's seen. But what happens is she realized, I know that ball. And the reason she knew the ball was because her kid had kicked it off a cliff 80 miles away from where the swimmer was, 10 days previous. So he kicks it off the cliff. She goes out and buys another ball. It's the end of the story, right, for her. And then 10 days later, a person doesn't drown because of that ball. Now, I include it in the book because it's a particularly vivid illustration of the reality that all of us are living these intertwined lives, right? We have this sort of delusion of individualism, which I was steeped in culturally because I grew up in the United States, probably the most individualist culture that's ever existed. And you have this moment where it's really obvious that's not true, right? Like this guy would be dead but for a kid kicking a soccer ball off a cliff. The kicker is that, pun intended, the kicker is that when you think about this, this is how everything is. It's not like there's a special cause and effect relationship for Ivan. It's literally how the world works. It's just that we're often completely oblivious to those moments where we were saved or we got a break or something terrible happened to us because of other people's decisions or choices. In my case, it was a mass murder 119 years ago. That was one of them. But everything in my life has been stitched together by an infinite number of decisions of people I don't know and will never meet.
There we are. Those are the 3 stories. The rest of it's just verbiage, actually. I wouldn't even. No, the opposite is the case. There are dozens of these stories, all of them fascinating and amazing in their own way. So what? So taking all of that, which, as you accept, people kind of intellectually grasp, and you think of the processes behind weather forecasting, which you talk a bit about, et cetera, what then does it mean for our lives that we have not properly focused on and discovered?
Yeah, so I think I'll break this into 2 parts. The first part is for our own lives. The second part is for our societies. And I think they're both important to think about with these ideas in chaos theory and the interconnectedness of the world. With our own lives, I have a phrase that I return to again and again in the book where I say, we control nothing, but we influence everything. It's a subtle paradigm shift about how you think about the way the world works. And I think so much that we're told about how to live or how to navigate existence is tied to this idea that you already know exactly what you want and you just need to go out and get it, right? It's the life hack checklist existence. And I think when you start to accept that you have less control, there are many philosophical implications that flow from that. For me, all of them uplifting. For example, when things go badly, it's partly not your fault. When things go well, it's also partly not your success to claim, right? I mean, the most important things in my life are basically things like where I was born, when I was born, who my parents were, and how my brain was structured. I had no control over any of those aspects of my life. I think they're the four most important things that has happened to me. And so, that I think is liberating in terms of how you think about this philosophically. It also means if you are in this interconnected chain of events, that your best moments and your worst moments are inextricably linked. They couldn't exist without each other. So every joy in my life is partly derived from a mass murder of children. But that also means that when I have a terrible moment, it's going to inevitably produce my happiest moments, which is a nice way of thinking about life and feeling the ripple effects that are sometimes foreseeable and sometimes completely unforeseeable of every action that we mean. And the third part of the subtitle in the book, Why Everything We Do Matters, I worry that people would think that I was making some abstract BS claim. I mean it completely literally. I mean it I don't think there's anything that we do that has no effect.
There is no airport in America that doesn't have a book entitled "Why Everything We Do Matters."
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Well done, actually,
Yeah,
Brian.
there you
Good
go.
for
So,
sales.
yeah.
Good for sales. A lot of disappointed execs settling into first class.
Yeah. So the second part of the question, though, the sort of societies, I think there's a really big mistake that we make, and I'm part of this because I'm a social scientist. I describe myself as a disillusioned social scientist. A lot of what we do is we take the complexity of the world, in which there's an infinite number of causes, and we model them, and we say, here are the 5 variables that produce this outcome. And that's not a problem if you understand it's a shortcut, right? If you understand that the model is a potentially useful tool, but it's not the real world. I think the problem is a lot of us have internalized this viewpoint that we can not only understand the world, but we can control it and manipulate it to our whims. And we only need to have these 5 variables under control and everything will be fine. And I think the story of the 21st century is a story of calamities that were unforeseen. You just go through them quickly. 9/11, the Iraq War, the financial crisis, the Arab Spring, one guy lights himself on fire in central Tunisia, multiple regimes collapse, and a civil war in Syria kills hundreds of thousands of people. You have the rise of Trump, Brexit, you have the pandemic with one virus and one mutation affecting one person. And then now what we have in Ukraine and Gaza, it's all these attempts to sort of control the uncontrollable. And I think when you accept that there are limits to what we can control, you have less hubris, and you also build systems that have more slack in them and slightly less optimization.
But do you also destroy? You're wonderfully rude about social sciences in the book. I'd never dare to say those things on the Today program, where social scientists are probably 83% of our audience. But to paraphrase Donald Trump, I did wonder as I read what you said about them, whether we ought to close it all down while we work out what's going on, because there is a sort of sense, the replication crisis that everyone here will know about in psychology, you're saying exists as well, perhaps less discovered right across the board when we're trying to think about how societies work.
Yeah, there's a chapter in the book that is not going to make me friends on the conference circuit because it's called The Emperor's New Equations. And it's about how some quantitative models, not all of them, I do quantitative modeling, I believe in it, but some quantitative models I think are worse than useless. I think they're actually dangerous. And they're dangerous because they reflect a funhouse mirror version of the world back at policymakers who then believe that they have figured out how the world works and then try to impose their will on it. And so, there's some things, I think about this in terms of the risks that we have today. And, a couple of years ago, there was a gust of wind that caused a boat to twist sideways in the Suez Canal, right, in 2021. That boat caused $54 billion of economic damage. That's just never been possible in the history of humanity, that a single boat turning sideways could cause economic calamity. So we've engineered systems that I think are so inelastic, so optimized to the absolute limit, that they become more likely to be catastrophically affected by what is sometimes dismissed as the noise. And so I think that comes out of a worldview of certainty and top-down control that I think flows from forgetting the lessons we all internally know from our own lives, that the small stuff can make a big difference. And chaos theory, in its formal, sort of articulation, says sensitivity to initial conditions, which is a fancy way of saying if you have a slight problem with your measurement or there's a slight tweak initially in the system, over time it can blow up to a huge shift. And I think that lesson is something that, unfortunately, we don't think about enough in modern life.
Okay, take it back to the individual. Where are we? Where are you? What agency do we have?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things, one of the problems with this worldview is that you can't know what the ripple effects of your actions are going to be, right? I mean, you could plant a tree and then a generation later a kid falls out of it and dies. I mean, these things happen, right? It's possible that you can have something that's a well-intentioned act, just as anything good that's derived from my life has been the byproduct of a mass murder of children. So those things are interrelated. How you actually live with that world is not that different from how I lived previously, in terms of I still try to be a good person. I still try to do things based on probabilistic reasoning of what's most likely to be useful and helpful in the world and so on. But I think philosophically I've felt, this is the only book I've ever written where I changed my worldview in the process. And I think it's been really liberating for me, because I think when you have this mentality, A, that everything happens for a reason, right? There's a grander purpose to everything. And B, that when you think about the way that you're supposed to live, that you are a purely strategic actor who's in control of all of the outcomes, which, the American dream, which I was steeped in, it's the rude way of describing it is it's your fault if you're poor, right? And I think when you sort of are liberated from that mentality, when I feel like a cosmic accident, and I also think there are a lot of things out of my control, I start to sort of just be able to enjoy life a bit more. And I think that's some of the stuff where I look around at the world, and there's a lot of people who live a life, and I was part of it. I did this much more previously, where every goal yielded another goal, every checklist yielded another checklist. And it's sort of like we've engineered this incredibly prosperous world, and a lot of us are really sad in it. And I think that's partly tied to this myth of control. I think it's much nicer to think about influence in all of the actions that we take, and how there is this sort of very weird dynamic, chaotic dynamic, that helps explain the relevance and importance of all of our individual lives.
But how does that influence how you behave?
Well, I walk my dog more. I mean, honestly, I wrote a lot of the book after I'd go on dog walks.
You're basically a former American, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So and I need to get my giant car and so on, shoot my gun. Yeah. This is the kind of stuff where I just think I think it's one where I feel on a day-to-day existence level like the pressure's a little bit more off, and like I should just enjoy stuff. I mean, there's a story I told in the book. So I'll tell this short version of the story, but there's a guy who was going to a conference, and he met a colleague, and the colleague gave him a tie, and the tie had a painting it was a Monet painting. He was an Impressionist art fan. And so he gets the tie. He's really touched by this gift. And so he says, I'm so touched by this, I'm going to go change my shirt so I can wear one that matches the Monet tie, and I'll go and iron my shirt. I'll be with you in 10 minutes. So she goes up to the conference. He goes back to his hotel room. As he's ironing the shirt, he looks out the window, and the first airplane hits the World Trade Center, which is where the conference is being held. So his colleague dies. Now, he survives as a result of this Monet painting tie being given to him at just the right moment. I met him in DC for the first time a week and a half ago. And I asked him about this. I said, how do you make sense of this worldview? And he said the most upsetting thing that somebody said to me, that somebody would say to me, and they'd said this to him for years, right, was everything happens for a reason. And the reason that was so upsetting, he said, was because that means that like the cosmic forces conspired to kill his colleagues who were supposed to die, and he was supposed to live. And it put this massive amount of pressure on his life, right? Because it was supposed to be, oh, you're the one who was chosen to survive. And when he started to let go a bit and say, I don't know, I was at the right place, right time. I got a tie for a gift, and I went to iron a shirt, and that's why I'm alive. I think that's when you start to process things differently. And so for me, I think, I genuinely feel like I have no cosmic purpose. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think I still have an influence on the world. I still think I care about a huge number of people, and I want to live my life as best I can. I think it's incredibly fortunate that I exist, because there's a series of things that would have stopped humans from existing, which I talk about in the book as well. But I think the end philosophy of this is, you're free to just live your life, and it's okay. And I think that's a message that is remarkably absent from self-help books, which tell you just do these 4 things and you'll be successful. And the way you'll be successful is you'll have more stuff and more status, which I don't actually think has made me happier. So,
Britain was like that in the 1970s. And I say that because I know you're an aficionado of English culture, and you will know probably then about Peter Cook and his homilies that he used to give. I can't remember the name of the character, but he was sitting on, lots of people here will know this, he was sat on a park bench, and he had a character who was a coal miner, and he said, I'm a coal miner, but I wanted to be a High Court judge, but I didn't have the Latin to be a High Court judge. I didn't have the Latin for the judging. And the whole joke, my mother, who found it enormously amusing because she thought it was a good thing that he didn't. She was a snob. She was of her age, and she thought it was a jolly good thing that this guy didn't become a High Court judge, because plainly he didn't speak properly and he didn't all the rest of it. But the joke was, in the 1970s Britain, it was the acceptance, actually, of exactly what you say, that you were part of a wider community, whether it was a union or a church or a political party or whatever. This country was set up like that. But I have to say, I'm not sure we were desperately happy with that either. And there is this sense in which we search as human beings, don't we, for how we can, as individuals, at least fool ourselves into thinking that we can make a difference. And actually, some individuals, do they not make that difference, or do they not?
Well, I think they absolutely do. I mean, I think the worldview that I have is that literally every person is important. I mean, I think this is something where, when I look at these, there's a series of things that I read
why
about.
are they important, Brian?
Because
given what all you've just said.
Because
I feel smaller and smaller by the second.
Because I think this is the beauty of the ripple effects that you get from chaos theory, right? So let's imagine that there's some random guy who lives in a hut in the middle of the forest and doesn't really amount to anything in his life, but falls in love and has a kid, and then 12 generations later, that's Albert Einstein. I mean, this is the way the world works. We don't know what we're going to change, and I think this is the thing that I find incredibly profound and uplifting about thinking about chaos theory. Is I have this. There's a thought experiment early on in the book where I say, look, when you think about time travel, right? Everybody has this sort of idea around time travel where they accept this principle where people say, if you go back in 1,000,000 years, don't squish any bugs. If you go back to your parents' generation, don't talk to anyone, because you might delete humans or you might delete yourself from the future, right? And the point I make is, well, hold on. If we accept that in the past, why don't we accept that in the present? Cause and effect didn't work differently in the past. It's the same cause and effect. So if squishing a bug 1,000,000 years ago could delete humans, squishing a bug today could delete something from 1,000,000 years in the future, right? The same as a conversation now will change who exists in the future. And I think the logical aspect of this that I think is very difficult to argue with is when you think about moments like the moment a baby is conceived, right? I won't go into detail on this, but the moment
it's a grown-up audience. I think you can.
But the moment a baby is conceived, you think about this, okay? So a millisecond difference, you have a different kid, right? Now, that means that it's obviously literally true that if you had either sipped a cup of coffee that day or not, you've made a different kid. But that's also true the day before. And it's also true the day before that, because there's an unbroken chain that leads up to this moment that produces that exact instant where your child is born. And of course, that's going to change your life, but it's also going to change who's in the world, right? I mean, when people react to me about the Kyoto story, one thing that they often say to me is, the US would have won the war anyway. I'm like, okay, but humans impose binary categories on the world. The world is not a category. The war would have ended differently. And not only that, but different people would have lived and died, right? Meteorology is a theme in the book. The guy who the F scale, the tornado scale, is named after was in Kyoto. So he was one of the people who ended up producing lots of life-saving innovations in meteorology. He would have died. So I think it's the kind of thing where when you imagine all these thought experiments, would World War I have happened if Archduke Franz Ferdinand's car had not sputtered to a stop by accident in front of his assassin Gavrilo Princip, starting World War I? Well, the Archduke did come to England 8 months earlier and went to Welbeck Abbey on a hunting expedition. And the loader who was loading the guns for the expedition slipped in the fresh snow, and the bullet missed the Archduke's head by 3 inches. Now, I don't know what would have happened if he died there, but World War I would have unfolded differently. I don't know how. It might not have happened. It might have happened. But it would have ended differently. It would have started differently. And I think there's this mistake we make cognitively where we take what the jargon of social science would say is a continuous variable, which is basically a continuous thing of causes and effects, and puts them into discrete categories that have binary outcomes. You win the war, you lose the war. If Kyoto got bombed, Kyoto wouldn't exist, and Japan would have unfolded slightly differently, and it could have been in a very, very big way. So I think when I say everything we do matters, I think this is the opposite of nihilism. It's the thing where every action that we take actually affects the trajectory of our lives and also, in some way, the trajectory of the future of the world.
But you're not suggesting that an individual who is born, whether it's Einstein or Donald Trump or whoever, actually is not going to have an effect themselves. That's the point, isn't it? I mean, they can as an individual.
Completely.
So, or the assassin of the Archduke. Or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's people who will have different levels of influence on short time scales. So as a shorthand, probabilistically, if you're the president of the United States, your mood matters more than the average person, right? Because if you're in a bad mood, it's going to have more consequences. But at the same time, a guy who sold vegetables in central Tunisia caused the Arab Spring. Yeah. So, he lit himself on fire in late 2010, and then multiple regimes collapsed and hundreds of thousands of people died in Syria. So what I talk about in the book is sort of the ways in which I think there is still room for us to think, in trends, in models, in probabilities, and so on. But the sort of savvy political scientists before 2016 in the United States would have said, leave the sort of analysis of the personality of the president to the cable TV hosts. The real serious political science, we look at the institution, the presidency, not the president. Trump obliterated that. I mean, no one thinks the world would be the same place if Hillary Clinton had won. So this is the kind of stuff where I think, the question is, how visible will the impact be of an individual and how short of a time scale? But, I think the people alive today are potentially going to be, there could be a random person who's highly, highly consequential 1,000 years into the future that's living today that we have no idea about. Yeah. It's impossible to say.
So the whole sort of great man theory of history is perfectly commensurate, actually, with what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's both. I mean, what I do, there's a story that I talk about in the book around great man theory, and I think there's elements of it that are over the top, where it's everything is the engines of history are driven by great men, or whatever. I don't believe that. But I do think that there are pivotal moments where individuals make a really profound difference. And there's a lot of evolutionary biology in the book. So I'll tell a brief story that I mentioned in Fluke about Charles Darwin, because he is used as the antithesis to the great man theory, where what happened was when he discovered evolutionary theory, he basically put it in a drawer for a while, and then gets a letter from a guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, a very famous naturalist, who effectively comes up with the same theory at effectively the same time. And the letter lays out evolution, and Darwin says, oh no, I better publish this. So he rushes to publish it by John Murray, who published my book. So it's the same publisher, which is always nice to have. Now,
so without Darwin, anyway.
Yeah, but the point though is here. So people say, okay, well, hold on. This means that it doesn't matter whether it was Darwin or not. It would have happened. And Darwin was almost, it's sort of poetic in the Fluke mentality, because Darwin was almost kept off the beagle because the captain believed that you could tell someone's virtues from the shape of their nose, and he did not like Darwin's nose. So Darwin has this thing where he says, I convinced him that my nose had spoken falsely, and so on, and he gets on the ship. So anyway, the point is that then Darwin rushes out on the origin of species, and so people say, well, it would have happened anyway. Alfred Russel Wallace would have popularized this if not. Well, there's 2 points I make this. One is that Alfred Russel Wallace also believed in seances, and he also believed he could conjure things out of thin air. So if the evolutionary theory had been presented by someone who was also arguing, not that we were just descended from primates potentially, but also that he could make things appear in the air, evolutionary theory had a hard time getting traction as it was. How would it have gone with the seance guy, right? But also, Darwin's cousin was Francis Galton, who was one of the founding fathers of eugenics. And he came across some of the ideas in eugenics from Darwin. So, how would history have unfolded if it had been Wallace, who had a different set of relatives, popularizing this? Maybe Galton doesn't have the same interest in evolutionary theory and becoming involved with eugenics. And I think this is the point. It's that even if you have the same exact invention, you have a slightly different, if Steve Jobs is a different person, you'd have a different trajectory for smartphones. So the timing matters, the person matters. It's not that there's great man theory versus trends, they're both important. It's that all of the things are important. They all are contingent on sort of them coming at exactly the right moment with exactly the right person for the outcome that we observe to have happened. You
mentioned biology. The book has got a lot of fascinating biology. What a fascinating subject that has become, and how cutting edge in all of this. Because, certainly when I went to school, God, it was boring. I'm sorry if there are any biologists there. I was, in fact, not allowed to take the O-level as it then was because I wrote an essay about the alimentary canal saying it went from London to Liverpool and was being restored by the London to Liverpool Alimentary Canal Society. But the joke is on me because, I mean, there is quite a lot of evolutionary biology that is cutting edge in a sense that it is telling us stuff about ourselves which we really have not properly known or properly focused on ever before.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few main strands to this, and one of them I want to talk about is a debate that has existed in evolutionary biology for a long time, but I think it's a really interesting framework for human change. And this is the debate between what's called contingency and convergence in evolution. So contingency is the sort of stuff happens theory of evolution, and convergence is the everything happens for a reason version of evolution. And so very shorthand stories to explain the difference. The contingency in evolution is the space rock that wiped out the dinosaurs. So you've got this Oort cloud in the distant reaches of space that vibrates, or oscillates as they say. It flings a rock towards Earth. It hits the Earth in exactly the right place, which is to say this gypsum-rich rock that produces a toxic cloud. And it produces massive, extreme temperatures on the surface. And this is the origin story of mammals rising because dinosaurs get wiped out. And mammals take over, basically, or become much more prominent, which is the origin story of human life. And everything that you see around you is basically derived from either something that could dig or something that could swim 66 million years ago, because everything else died. So contingency is, the space rock is delayed by 2 seconds. Human history is gone. That's, it's the moment where you think about, okay, but for this, we wouldn't exist. And so that's the contingency idea. Convergence has... But there's still order, right? Because some things work and some things don't. And my favorite example of this is if you were to take the eye of an octopus and you were to take a human eye, don't do this, but if you were to take a human eye and look at them next to each other, 600 million years ago, the branches of evolution for these two species diverged. So they're completely separate. But the eye is almost identical. And it's not because we got lucky twice, it's because there's a very effective system for navigating a world to help organisms survive long enough to have children, which is what evolution selects for. So if you think about that, it's like, okay, both of these frameworks work really well for explaining human change. It's a mix of the two. We have some events that are contingent. So you have 9/11 happens, and American history is going to unfold differently. And then you also have trends. You have economic factors. You have, the resentment for immigration that produces the opportunity for someone like Trump to emerge. And it's a mix of the two, right? I have a very clunky term. Normally I try to avoid clunky terms, but I call it contingent convergence, which is basically to say you have these moments where things flip, and then you also, within those spaces, you have some order, some structure that leads to convergence of things that actually work or things that have order within them. And I think that's the way the world works. And I think evolutionary biology has given us frameworks to think about human change that are also useful for our own lives, because the sliding doors question that started things off, I coin a phrase in here that's called the snooze button effect. And I say, you imagine your life where you wake up and you're tired, and you hit the snooze button, and then your life rewinds by 5 seconds, and you don't hit the snooze button. And if a lot of things change in your life, then that was a contingent moment. If very little changes, it was a convergent moment. It was something where the train left the station a little bit later, but it stayed on the same tracks. And so these are frameworks for change that I think I've borrowed from this discipline. I spent a lot of time with evolutionary biologists, and I think they're very useful ways of thinking about how our lives unfold and how our societies change over time.
I want to press you on free will in
Yes.
the kind of 10 minutes remaining before we throw it open to everyone to go in whatever direction they want. You say in the book, and this is a great phrase, not clunky at all, you say you are the contingent culmination of the entirety of cosmic history. Everything had to be exactly as it was for you to exist, just as you are in this precise moment in this exact world. This leads us to a simple, wondrous truth. We are all the living manifestations of 13.7 billion years of flukes, which I think you think is comforting. I'm not at all sure that everyone will be comforted by that. How deterministic are you? How fully sold on the idea are you that absolutely nothing in life is chance?
Yeah, so first off, I would say that I do find it uplifting. Richard Dawkins has this phrase that I borrow in the book where he describes the infinite number of unborn ghosts, which is to say all of the possible creatures, all the possible humans that could exist that don't. And I find it amazing that I get to inhabit this incredible place with incredible people for however many years I'm alive. I mean, it feels extraordinarily lucky because there's just an infinite number of things that don't exist. So I do think there's a second where the asteroid hits, and maybe something better than humans would have existed. I don't know, but it is that fragility I find really wondrous and awe-inspiring. In terms of the sort of aspects of determinism, I don't believe in free will. I'll get that out there. So, but the reason for that is it's a question about the origins of human behavior. And basically what it boils down to for me is I don't believe there's a difference between the linguistic phrases of the mind and the brain. Like when we think, those words mean different things in English, right? I don't actually think there's a difference. I think the mind is the brain. I think I'm what's called a physicalist, which means that I think that everything that I do and say is physically caused by chemical reactions in my brain.
And you're a believer in that French guy, whose name I can't remember, who's devil or who's...
Oh, Laplace's demon,
What's his name?
Laplace,
who you quote. Tell us about the demon.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a thought experiment that there's wrinkles around this because of quantum mechanics, which I won't go into, but it's basically the thought experiment
It's a great Today program moment where you're looking at the pips and he says, I could go through the quantum mechanics of that. And you think, no! But anyway, don't go into the quantum mechanics.
So basically, Laplace's demon, it's a thought experiment from Pierre-Simon Laplace. And what he basically says is, if you imagine that you could absolutely know with certainty, this super intelligent being could know with certainty the exact location, momentum of every atom in the universe with complete precision, then you could see the future as well as you could see the past, right? And you'd sort of be able to predict into the future. Quantum mechanics has some serious wrinkles for this because there's basically belief that there are some things that are truly random at the subatomic and atomic level, and I don't know whether that's true because the interpretation is contested. But the point here, I think, is that what I do think is, and this is something where many, many people will disagree with me, is I think that every event has causes. I don't think it has necessarily larger purpose to it, right? But I think that what I do now is caused by the state of my brain in this instant. And what I'm going to do in 5 minutes is caused by the state of my brain in 5 minutes. And those things are linked. They're going to cause each other in this unbroken series of chain reactions, basically. And I think this is stuff where, this doesn't mean you can't make decisions. Of course you make decisions, right? The debate basically is there something non-physical in your mind? And this is where, in the past, there was widespread belief in a homunculus inside your head that was sort of calling the shots. Religious believers, of course, have a view around the soul, which is a non-physical entity that can control, your actions and choices and so on in a way that's separate from your brain. But personally, I believe that my mind and my brain are the same thing, and I don't have any ability to stop cell division. I don't know why I would have any ability to control the chemical reactions in my brain either. And I have this sort of flippant illustration of this in that chapter, but it's how I came across this in my own life was. When I was like 9 years old, my dad showed me the Gettysburg film and took me to the Gettysburg battlefield in Pennsylvania. And I was a very nerdy kid, which I'm sure will come as a huge shock to everyone in the room. But I got completely hooked. I subscribed to 2 Civil War magazines as a 9-year-old. And I wanted
both sides.
Exactly. No, thankfully not. Thankfully not on that one. No.
Very BBC.
But I wanted to become a Civil War reenactor as a 9-year-old. My parents stopped me from committing social suicide and did not allow me to do that. But I think to myself, like, did I choose as like a 9-year-old to the thing that would be great is to be like a Civil War aficionado, right? I mean, no, like I was just gripped by it. And I say this, if some of you will read the book and you'll hate it, and some of you will read the book and you'll love it, and I don't think you can choose. I think you're just going to read it, and it's either going to be something you like or something you don't like.
But how can you find that uplifting? I mean, I agree with you, but I find it intensely depressing, actually. And a lot of people who understand determinism in the way you talk about it in the book are depressed by it.
Yeah, but I think that's where that influence side of things comes in, right? So whether I have independent causal control over my brain, I'm part of this like unbelievable thing that is existence and consciousness, and I'm part of shaping the way the world is forever, right? I mean, I'm maybe a
But
small
you're
part of
not
it.
shaping it.
No, but I
it's
am.
shaping you.
Well, okay, that's fine. But
You see, I think you could rewrite the top of this, and instead of saying why everything we do matters, you could say why everything we do doesn't matter.
No, but
Can't you?
so I think there are people who, when they first come across these ideas, become very nihilistic. I think when you think about them, it's sort of, to me, it's incredibly joyful to think that you're part of this contingent culmination of, as you quoted from the book, 13.7 billion years of flukes. I find that immensely awe-inspiring. Like the fact that I exist is unbelievable. It's incredibly improbable. And somebody else would exist if my parents had met different people. Somebody else would probably exist. But I exist, and I think that's amazing for me to go through the world through this sort of random process that led to me. And I'm captivated by it. I think there's a great scientific study I quote in the book where the best scientific evidence for why humans or mammals don't lay eggs, according to evolutionary and genome testing, is that 100 million years ago, this random shrew-like creature got infected with a retrovirus that led to placenta, and that's why we don't lay eggs. And I think about that, I'm like, that's amazing. Because if that hadn't happened, we surely wouldn't exist, or certainly, egg laying would be quite a thing. So, but this is the kind of stuff where when you think about it, I don't know. To me, the awe, the wonder of it, the fact that I am going to be shaping in some way the way that some humans will live 100, being the byproduct of a 119-year-old mass murder, things that I decide in my life are going to affect people who I'll never meet, who will live in a society I can't imagine. And to me, like, being able to enjoy life in that world is enough. Like, I don't think that I have to say to myself that I have some sort of independent causal control over my brain. My brain is the way it is, and I'm happy with it. And I think it's sort of, it's a philosophical choice that I think a lot of people shy away from thinking about these topics. When you write a book like this, you don't hope everyone will agree with you. You hope that everyone will think about these questions. And I hope that many of you disagree with me. I think it's something where, these are some of the largest questions about what it means to be a human. And we tend to think a lot about the sort of day-to-day life, the checklist stuff. I think the questions about, what is the purpose of our lives, if there is one, is worth pondering. And I hope that, you might think that I'm, completely wrong about free will or about the way that the world works. But the best emails you get as an author are the ones that say, it made me think differently about the way I live my life. That's all you can hope for with a book like this.
And at a policy level, and you hinted at this earlier on, if people internalize and think about the things that you write about here, it does lead to a really changed way in which society works.
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental difference in how we live compared to how our ancestors lived that I think has policy implications for the way we think about the world. So the brief version of this is that, when you think about hunter-gatherers through the vast stretch of human history, 9,100 out of 9,500 generations of humans lived as hunter-gatherers. They had to deal with uncertainty that was in their day-to-day life. It was like, am I going to get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger? Am I going to starve to death? But their world didn't change generation to generation, right? Like, if you knew how to gather berries, you could teach your kids, they would do the same thing. What we've basically done is we've inverted that relationship. So we have the illusion of control because we live in the most regular and predictable day-to-day existence that was ever possible, right? And yet the way the world is changing rapidly is never, it's unprecedented. So, I sort of have I have a line in Fluke where I say we've invented an upside-down world where Starbucks never changes, but rivers dry up and democracies collapse. And I think this is the kind of stuff where when you think about the world that way, and you've engineered a world that has lots and lots of change and very little slack because of this optimization and this sense of control, what you need to have an appreciation for is that the illusion of control that you get from having your commute down to the minute or being able to conjure up a package from Amazon for the exact day is something that should not leak into your understanding of how the general social world works. And I think that's happened. I think that people have gotten a sense that they can control macro level change, and it's created hubris that has amplified the risks that we face. And so, I would rather have a world in which we have slightly less efficiency, slightly less optimization, but more slack in the systems, more give in the systems, so that there are fewer catastrophes. And I think that's the kind of stuff where it's going against the grain of what the conventional wisdom is that every ounce of inefficiency is bad. But the Suez Canal thing it's impossible to have that if you have a little bit more leeway and a little bit more resilience.
You say it's going against conventional wisdom. Are policymakers actually beginning to catch on to that?
I don't know. I mean, I look at things like the lessons from the financial crisis. I look at lessons from the pandemic that haven't been learned in terms of prevention and so on. I'm not sure. I don't think, and the language we talk about this with matters too, right? So everyone describes these as external shocks. I don't think they're external shocks. I think they are the byproduct of a system that has absolutely no resilience and is prone to small fluctuations, which are inevitable. So, this is the kind of stuff where I worry about us learning the lesson, and I do think that if you accept a little bit less control and a little bit less hubris, you end up with the life advice that my grandfather gave me when I was a kid, which he's one of the people, he's the son of the man who found his family dead. And you can understand why he came to this, but he had 2 words of wisdom for me. He said, if you want to live a successful life, what you should do is avoid catastrophe. And I think that's a pretty good benchmark for politicians to use as their main guiding principle.
Yeah.
So.
On that note, let me throw it open to people to ask whatever they want. Do we have microphones, or should we just get people to? Yes, hold on a second. They're going to come to you. So let's go maybe into the middle here, and then we'll come down to the. Whoa, okay. Hand a microphone to someone with their hand raised. There are several people over there, and we'll take it from you. Yeah. Hold on a second.
Anyway, I'll shout.
They'll switch it on as it.
I'm trying to articulate this question well enough, but there are individual actors, and then there is the sort of cumulative culture. And I think you're talking a lot about the individual actors. Clearly human history is formed with this cumulative knowledge, cumulative way of being, which you might be, in a multi-level analysis, you might be able to predict more about being shaped. Like it's probably inevitable that the US is having, and we are having this internal tension from the sort of course of history, but not necessarily the precise actors that cause it. You get what I mean? I'm not answering very well, though.
Yeah, so this is where the way I'd answer this, and I think that we live in a world that is partway between order and disorder. So you're talking about the order of things, right? The disorder might come from the individuals, but the order might be the long-term trends. There's a way that I reconcile this. I borrow this term from physics called the sand pile model, and it's a very simple idea where you basically imagine that you've got grains of sand that you just keep on stacking over and over and over, and eventually you get a pile of sand, right? Well, at some point the sand pile gets so tall that a single grain of sand will cause an avalanche. And that is a system that's on what physicists would call the edge of chaos, where a tipping point becomes possible. So when you think about something like Trump's rise, okay, the individual is important, but all these other factors had to exist. The sand pile had to get tall enough so that it was possible for him to exploit some of the divisions in the country and so on. And I think, the Arab Spring example that I talked about before, if a random vegetable vendor sets themselves on fire in Norway, I don't think it's going to cause a giant uprising. So, the sand pile was not tall enough. And World War I is a case where you have a sand pile hit at its absolute limit. All the alliances set up this creation of a dynamic where a single individual getting killed then can trigger a world war. So it's not the case. I'm not arguing that it's just, random stuff happens and that the trends don't matter. I'm saying that the interaction between the way the system is designed and then the way that individuals within that system act creates these outcomes. And so, you can see the sand pile growing, and you can say, there's anti-immigrant sentiment that's growing in the United States. Trump saw that, he capitalized on it, and so it's an interaction between his personality, his origin story, and so on, and then also the underlying trends and order and so on. So, some of these things are relatively predictable, but of course, if you tried to predict the US in 2024, if Hillary Clinton had won, which, was possible, it was a very close election, I think a lot of us would infer backwards that this was inevitable, because that's the way we do history and it's the way we do a lot of politics. We say, of course Trump was just a flash in the pan. Somebody who ran such an undisciplined campaign could never have won, and then we would have learned that lesson instead. So, this is the kind of stuff where I think it's an intersection between the two. They both are important.
Has the microphone gone to someone else? The magic microphone that wasn't then working, but it might do now. Here we go. You could maybe pass it from one to the other, because there are a couple of them. Yes, it's working.
First, thank you. It's wonderful to hear you talk. It just reminded me of another book called The Fourth Turning. I don't know if you've read that.
I haven't, no, sorry.
Which is about the cyclical of generations and the fact
Oh,
that
yes, okay, yeah.
every fourth generation we do repeat ourselves. And in times of crisis, certain leaders come to the top, and then certain innovations and certain crises then appear. In times of peace, other innovations, other leaders are brought forward. So at the end of the day, regardless of what we do, the cyclical of every fourth generation, and this goes back 500 years, and they predicted Trump basically 20 years ago. So all these little things we do, you can say it's chance, but the fact that the external elements do impact on how we choose our leaders and how we deal with crisis and how innovation emerges somehow allows us to be thinking about predetermination or prediction of the future as well. How does that kind of relate to what you're talking about?
Well, my book is diametrically opposed to that idea. So you can read it and decide which one you think is right. But, there's a lot of books. There's a guy, Peter Tchin, who just came out with a book.
End Times.
Yeah, which has a similar sort of sense of this. And we just fundamentally disagree. I mean, we have a disagreement about whether history moves in cycles. There are some trends that I think are important, but I think actually there are a lot of aspects of history that are far more contingent. And I think the cyclical argument, it's elastic enough that you can always point to, oh, well, this now I've been validated because this thing happened. It's to me, it's a little bit like the fortune teller who gets 6 things wrong but 1 thing right. Oh, wow, what an amazing feat. So I think there is some of that. And as I say, you can read the book, hopefully, and you can tell me which one you think is right.
Yeah, good answer. Can we come right to the front now with our microphone? And we've got plenty of time, so we can go, well, I said plenty. Yeah, we've got 20 minutes. Here we go. Hand it to Paul, and then Paul, maybe you could pass it back.
Great, thanks. I agree with all of that, which may just be because of the way my brain is wired. I may have not any choice about agreeing with any of that. But I wanted to get to the sort of so what bit of it. And you've indicated a couple of things. Certainly, I think, the way that social scientists think about the world and sort of the need for sort of more humility about that, absolutely. You've talked about resilience in systems, absolutely. The third thing I wanted to ask you about was what this means for the concept of desert or just desert and meritocracy. And I think what you indicate is actually, Elon Musk could realise he's lucky as well as whatever else he is. And my sense is that there is a bit of a split in the population. Actually, some people believe that people get where they are essentially because of what they did, and some people believe that context is really terribly important. And I think you're pushing us towards the context and everything else that matters. Does thinking as you do mean essentially that drives you towards a liberal politics as opposed to a conservative politics?
Yeah, I don't think it fits neatly. There's things that are challenging, I think, for both perspectives. I will say, so on the luck aspect of this, there's a brief section of the book where I touch on this. And when you think about a model of the world in terms of, if there was a pure meritocracy, there would be a strong correlation between talent and wealth, right? Or some sort of correlation between talent and wealth, that you would be successful if you were talented. And so the problem is that, talent is points that have been made by Nassim Nicholas Taleb previously and so on, but talent is one of those traits, like many human traits, that are normally distributed, which is to say that like height is a normally distributed trait, such that there's nobody who's 1,000 times taller than you. There's basically a bell curve, and we're sort of around that bell curve. There's a large number of people in the middle, and there's sort of some people who are really tall, some people who are really short, and so on. Wealth is not like that. Wealth is a long-tail distribution, right? So there are people who are 1,000 times richer than you, even 1,000,000 times richer than you. And so this is something where, when you think about that, luck then plays a role. And these economists and physicists put together a model that I actually think is a very clever one, even though I've told you the models are problematic for a while. And what they did is they said, okay, let's imagine that we have talent on one hand, wealth on the other, and then every so often luck will strike like lightning, right? It will just hit somewhere in the population. Where is it most likely to hit? Well, the answer is near the middle, because that's where billions of people are. So if luck is a random distribution, which is basically what we do agree luck is, then you're going to most likely have lucky things happen most often towards the middle of the talent distribution, and very rarely will lightning strike on the extreme tail where the most talented person is. So in their model, they found that overall in the simulations they run over and over and over, the richest person in the world was actually slightly above average in talent, but never on the extremes. Now, I think about this in terms of how we process these ideas in a more sort of close to home thing. I mean, one of the things that I do as a social scientist, I study broken authoritarian systems around the world. I spent a lot of time in Madagascar, for example. And it's one of the poorest countries in the world. 40% of the population has electricity. The average person lives on $1.90 a day. I mean, if I was born in rural Madagascar with exactly the same brain and exactly the same parents as I have, I am 100% certain I would not be in this room. I wouldn't have left Madagascar. There's no way. So I think that there's just, there are certain things where we like to imagine, of course, there's a loose correlation between hard work, talent, success, and so on. And of course, we're striving creatures. We should strive to do better. But the idea that I have caused all of my success independently is just such a lie. I mean, it's just, I'm built on all these things. Now, how you deal with this with meritocracy, I think, is a really interesting question, because we've already sort of done this in a way, but we don't talk about it, which is to say, I think many of us would accept that there is at least a segment, and the jury's out about how much of this, but a segment of intelligence is probably partially derived from genes and upbringing, which are not things that we control ourselves, right? Now, if that's the case, then it's sort of unfair to allocate jobs based on that. But of course, the person in charge of cancer research should be smart. So you have this sort of acceptance that you're going to have something that is somewhat arbitrary, and yet you're still going to structure society this way. And Sam Harris, the neuroscientist, who I disagree with a lot of the things that he says, but he has a great quote about free will. He says, the origin of human behavior isn't really that important, because if we could jail hurricanes and tornadoes, we would. We don't think they cause these things out of their own choice, but they're dangerous. So if someone is a person who's a mass murderer, even if they don't have free will, there's a social value to deterrence and to stopping crime and so on, even in a world in which we accept the lack of free will. So I think there are ways to have social change that reflects some of these ideas that might actually be more compassionate to people who end up, through no fault of their own, having a lack of opportunities that I was very lucky to have.
Okay, another question? You already have the microphone.
I do. I was born and raised in Kyoto, Japan, so I'm thinking a lot about those what ifs. Is there any sliding door moment that you can lead us to where we would not be facing the choice of Trump and Biden?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you two of them. I love weird stories, as you can probably tell. So one of them is the origin story of Trump that is hypothesized, and I can't verify this, but people around him have said this is true, is in 2011, at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, Barack Obama roasted Trump publicly. And he said some joke to the effect of, I have it so easy as president, whereas, Trump has the decisions that would keep him up at night, such as deciding who to fire on Celebrity Apprentice. And it's sort of this jab at him being a small fish with really easy reality TV show stuff. And the people around Trump have said, some of them have said, that that's the night he decided to run for president. So maybe there's a joke that was part of the origin story. And that's one of the contingencies. The other one is the only set of images in the book that I think is really fascinating that spared us a second Trump term, is if you look at county-level election results in the 2020 race, so you map all the election results in various states, if you zoom in on Georgia, which is the state that was decisive and also gave the Democrats control of the Senate, there is a blue, which is to say Democratic, curve through Georgia. And what that is, believe it or not, is the remnants of an ancient inland sea where 66 million years ago there was a coastline right there. Phytoplankton lived there. They died, obviously, and they became really, really rich soil. So when slavery was established, this is where the plantations were set up. And this is where African slaves were brought to the United States. And when slavery ended, this is where a lot of the African-American population settled. And they still skew Democratic. And what you're seeing in the demographic vote patterns is literally contingent on geological forces. Mm-hmm. So, I think I see this everywhere. I think there are just a million things that could have gone differently. If Mitt Romney had won in 2012, he would have been the nominee in 2016. So maybe the Republican Party doesn't go down the road it's gone now. And so there's an argument that some people would make that it would have been better for America if Obama had lost in 2012, because then Romney is the candidate in 2016. He's going to obviously not face a primary challenger. Trump doesn't emerge. I mean, it's just infinite numbers of these things. And on top of that, there was a congressman named Anthony Weiner who had some real problems with sending text messages. And this is something where it caused the reopening of the FBI investigation a week before the 2016 election. Did that sway 70,000 people in 3 states? I don't know. So there's loads upon loads of contingencies that might have gone differently. If Joe Biden's son had not died, he might have ran for president in 2016, which he decided not to do. So, I mean, it's an infinite number of possibilities. And I think what we do is we stitch together a really neat and tidy story to tell how everything makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, who else? Who's got the microphone? Yes, you got the microphone. Go. And then we'll go back to the back as well. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I'd like to build on the comment you made. Your brain is what it is, that you have no control over it, and also the comments around genetics. What role do you see energy play in this? And let's get a bit more scientific here with regards to physics, quantum physics, that you know everything has a vibrational force and it attracts the outcome that you seek. Then that pair it with the with the view that you come to the awareness of how you would desire to feel, understanding of what's stopping you from achieving the desired state, and then pursue change, right? And often that's related to, you mentioned about the family you're born into, environment, so a lot of it has to do with the conditioning you acquire at birth, during educational years, and later in life. But then you come to a point, I know what's causing the pain, I know what's causing the struggle, and I can follow a framework to overcome that. Is that pure chance, or do you feel that there's the element of vibrational force that you can emit in order to bring about that change?
Well, I mean, so I should be very clear that I'm not what's called a genetic determinist. So I don't believe that genetics determines everything. And there's growing scientific evidence that actually we've probably overstated that case. But what I'm saying in terms of the physics of it is that the combination of genes plus experience changes your brain structure, which then causes you to make decisions the way you do. In terms of the question around energies and so on, I mean, I don't believe there's any evidence that this is something that sways outcomes or that we have some special force that we can use to sort of manifest things. I strongly disagree with that idea. But I think one of the things I will say is that I also have a section in the book where I say there's a lot of stuff we simply don't understand. It's not anti-scientific to say this. I believe very firmly in science. But like the fundamental experience of being human is consciousness. And we just have no idea. We don't understand anything about it. And this is the hard problem of consciousness, as philosophers call it, is something that we haven't even begun to crack. So, I don't believe in sort of energies or any of those sorts of things, but I do believe that there are a lot of things about the world that remain mysterious. And I think that, the questions on some of these issues around the role of genetics, epigenetics, as well as the ways in which these things get encoded in our brains. This science is rapidly evolving, and it is something that is important to watch in the 21st century, basically. Yeah.
Okay, could we go round to the back and then we'll come forward again? Yes, you've got the microphone.
Hello. My question is the sentiment of everything matters versus everything is significant. So I'm a physicist by academic background, and I agree with you that small changes can have large impacts. I feel almost that I'm going to be paralyzed walking out of this room if I think that everything I do is significant and I might not be able to take another action ever again. So with billions of sort of small things happening all the time and billions of insignificant things happening all the time, is it just the fact that we don't know the specific small thing that we do which will have the big impact, and therefore we do need to pay attention to everything? Or is it that we can just live our lives in sort of blissful ignorance and then just know that some small things will actually make a big difference?
Yeah, it's more the latter, I would say. I'm not paralyzed by this, and I think it's because you can't know, right? So there's a few things that are important. One is that there's the question of timescales, and if I slap the snooze button today, the world will be a little bit different. will it have any sort of discernible impact in my life? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. So that's the question, is like, are we going to see it? That's the example I gave of, who Albert Einstein's great-great-great-great-grandfather played a role that was, was part of the Kyoto story as well, because Einstein was involved in the science behind it. So, but I think that is part of it. The other part of it is that when we think about these sliding doors moments, which you all discussed previously, those are the visible pivots in our lives. Like, if you can answer that question, you know that it was important. And the point that I make is that there's an infinite number of invisible pivots that you cannot know. You don't know what the alternative pathway is with the snooze button. You'll never see it, because we get to go through life in one way, right? So you're not going to be paralyzed by this in a sort of pragmatic sense, because you will never know whether hitting the snooze button was a good or bad thing for your life. And I think that's fine. I think it's just one of those things where the mentality and the philosophy that flows out of the idea that our actions matter, I find that uplifting and empowering. I'm not, paralyzed by hitting the snooze button. I just think that when I'm doing things, I'm gonna, if I do hit the snooze button, I'll have different conversations that day. I'll meet different people. Those will lead to ripple effects that will cause me to potentially diverge from my path that I would have had. But you still have to make the choice in the moment if you're tired, and that's it. So, I don't think there's anything that you radically change about your day-to-day life, other than, and I talk about this in the book, and I won't go into detail here, but I think there's a very large premium that we should put on experimentation, because there's a lot more uncertainty than we accept, and so trying new things actually is a very smart strategy in a world that is far more uncertain than we think.
Do you ever get your hand to hover above the snooze button and think, hang on a second, I'm going to do it? No, I'm not. You're great fun to be waking up with in every sense. There's a question here at the front.
Hi, thanks for a really thought-provoking talk. I'm curious your perspective on what the impact of some of our modern technologies like AI, like machine learning, have on chaos theory. Does it exacerbate the effects? Does it smooth out the variability, or does it just increase the randomness? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it embeds systemic risk in very dangerous ways. There's lots of things. So that if there's closed systems that exist, which is to say like medical diagnoses, AI will be great, because there's not an outcome in which that is going to produce a world calamity, right? It will just help doctors make decisions. But the problem is, and this is one of the things, it goes back to sort of what's called the problem of induction from David Hume. How do you know that the past is going to be like the future? What AI is basically doing is it's taking patterns from the past on training data, and it's then trying to navigate a future. Now, that has always been a problem. Hume identified this problem hundreds of years ago. The problem is that the past is less predictive of the future, in my view, than ever before, because the underlying notions of cause and effect have shifted in a very, very short period of time, right? So if the way that, in the past, a hunter-gatherer could know, they could tell their kids, this is how the world works, it's a relatively good bet. We're in the only generation in human history, arguably, where parents are learning from children how to navigate the world, right? And I think that's because the underlying patterns of cause and effect are shifting. And we all understand this is the formal name of this non-stationarity in economics, but we all understand this intuitively with things like climate, because you get told, oh, there was another 100-year flood. It's like, well, there was one 3 years ago. Why does this keep happening every 3 years if it's a 100-year flood? Well, the underlying dynamics of climate systems have shifted, and the model hasn't been updated. So what I worry about with AI is that if it's not adapted appropriately and not done carefully, it can amplify that hubris that we know, because it's going to fit the equation to the past data very, very well, and then the underlying dynamics of cause and effect will differ, and we'll make a decision with this false sense of certainty, and that can be very, very dangerous. So I'm worried about turning over critical decision-making to AI in a world in which underlying cause and effect dynamics are more fluid than ever before.
Okay, one more question. I think someone's got the microphone at the back.
Hi, thanks so much. My question is about risk and how you incorporated this either in the book, or if not, what your thoughts are on it. Just to give some background, I'm when in my world, as the medical world, we think about the Swiss cheese model. So for example, those causes of chance and risk fall through the cracks, unfortunately in many cases, but also fortunately in other cases. So yeah, just curious about your thoughts on risk.
Yeah, so I highlight there's a dichotomy made by a guy named Frank Knight from early 20th century economics between risk and uncertainty. And these are sort of unintuitive ways of describing it, but basically risk is something that can be tamed. It's something where there's a predictability to it, and you can sort of manage it. So this is why like betting markets work really well in sports, where data analytics works really well in sports, because it's a relatively closed system. You can tame risk. Uncertainty is where there's no information, especially radical uncertainty, as Mervyn King and others have called it, is where there's no information from past data that can help you understand how to make a future decision. So again, an example that I use of this is when Barack Obama was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner roasting Trump, that night he decided whether to kill Osama bin Laden in the raid. He basically ordered the raid and then went and told the joke and then went back to the Situation Room. And in that moment, there was radical uncertainty because nobody knew whether Osama bin Laden was there. Nobody knew whether SEAL Team 6 would succeed. No one knew if Pakistan would respond to the raid with an attack. There was no way to know, right? So there was no way to navigate that risk with some sort of algorithm or model or anything like that. It was just he had to make a decision. But he crammed the probability into it. He said, give me a number. And people would say 60%, 90%. I mean, they were just making it up. It was a hunch. And so, because they didn't know. They didn't even know if he was in the building. So separating those two things out is smart for decision making. And then the other thing, and this is where your profession, the medical world, I think is got some much harder things to navigate than other areas of life, is that you have to separate between problems that have to have an answer and problems that don't have to have an answer. So if there's a rare disease you encounter and you don't know what it is and it's radical uncertainty, you still have to decide what to do with the patient. So you still have to choose. Whereas I don't think we need to forecast what inflation will be in Malawi in 2035, but we do, right? And it's sort of one of these things where it creates this sense of false certainty. And I think some of the time we'd be better off saying we don't know. So it's the kind of question where that's the way I would navigate that. I will say, as a person who goes on TV every so often, or the Today program, you can't say I don't know, right? It's embarrassing.
So we don't allow.
Yeah, and it's something that I think we should be more accepting of in the world, because there's a lot of questions we don't know the answer to, and we expect people to always give answers, even to questions that don't require them in the immediate moment.
I dare you next time. We've got to leave it there. But Brian's not going anywhere. He's going to go to the back, where it is already decreed that you will be buying. We already know that you're all going to buy a copy of the book, and I'm sure you can answer more questions there. But please, let's finish this part of the evening with a huge round of applause for the author.